True. Let's go to comma green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kanji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Trumpet drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the kanji verse.
You know, on the topic of Somalia, there's a lot of people who talk about Somali versus Bantu, the relationship between the Somalis and the Mushunguli people. You know, the idea that there is a long history of enslavement of particularly the Somali people who, you know, are Eurasians, Arabs, some people try to intimate, that crushed African people and that have always oppressed African people. This Hamiticist dichotomy between the Afro-Asiatic Somali and the so-called Bantu. See, a lot of this stuff is contrived. I mean, the Somali people, you know, some scholars have intimated that they're from the Ogaden Peninsula and that they migrated into Somalia. And the so-called Bantu people, the Mushunguli people, would be the indigenous population of the land. There's other studies that suggest that there was some genetic intermingling between both populations. But if we were to examine the categories themselves in Afro-Asiatic and Bantu, they would be related in aerial diffusion, right? Contact. When it comes to the Africanist approach, the way that they define these categories is not via the genetic method. It's more of a typological approach, looking at the borrowings between different languages, not necessarily to trace an ancestor or be able to affirm an ancestor, but to have a working hypothesis, right? The idea that all of the ancestors of the so-called Bantu populations originated on the Nigero-Cameroonian border is not proven, in the same way that the idea that the ancestors of all Afro-Asiatic people are rooted in the Red Sea hills of Ethiopia is not necessarily proven either, right? These are categories created by European ethnographers, working hypothesis to manage the African population, to sell chattel, right, out into the global economy, the Ma'afa. During the enslavement of African people, that's when these Hamiticists, right, these Göttingen school scholars came into the picture and wanted to categorize African populations, categorize their chattel, categorize their commerce. In Western historiography, being rooted and influenced by Africanist, this Africanist school of thought, is no wonder why the imposition of these colonial ideas are so pervasive within African society today. People talking about Bantus. What's a Bantu? People talking about Ham, the Hamite. You have people promoting the theory of Ham, right? The Hamiticist model, you know, using Genesis 9:21 to say that African people are cursed and inferior because they are the descendants of Ham, right? That is a myth. At the Cairo Symposium of 1974, Theophile Obenga and Sheikh Anta Diop stated that it was a myth, stated that it was a fraud. They proved the Africanists wrong. They proved the Greenbergian approach wrong by applying the historical comparative method, the same method used to unite the European languages and the Indian languages and Indo-European, Northern Indian, if you will, Indo-Aryan, if you will. The same methodology used to unite those could be used to unite the Pharaonic language and the languages of Africa, Black Africa specifically, the areas in which we called ourselves Black, or we used the terms like Kem, Maladula, Lawo, the Isi Jabudnis, and like areas where we use these terms to define ourselves as Black people on the African continent. These languages could be linked to the Pharaonic civilization in opposition of the Africanist approach. You know, in affirmation of approaches where we're talking about the Wangara inter-empire and Galam, Galanjam in Central and Southern Africa, these migratory puta, right? These migratory origins and onomastics, you know, from classical Africa to contemporary Africa, punt, right? Even if you look at punt, the idea Pwani, scholars like Felix Chami have extended that into Central and Southern Africa in his analysis of Azanian cartography and Azanian onomastics, Azanian naming conventions, the schematic geometric amorphous drawings or SGA drawings seen in the Swahili coast, right, that are similar to the Tifinagh script and more similar probably to the Rampa of Western Africa. And they're variant in the descendants of that in the Vai script, which would be a descendant of that if we were to follow the work of Delafosse. and other African scholars on the matter, right? So this is crystal clear that African scholars have never followed the same model as the Africanist. We use it as conventions within Western historiography, but the way that we develop our history is not the same as the Africanist. It is not the Greenbergian approach. It is not based upon looking at borrowings between these languages laterally. They only look at contemporaneous languages and they infer, in the past based upon a horizontal analysis of borrowed terms in contemporary languages. They don't apply internal reconstruction or even the external reconstruction, being able to find the pre-dialectical ancestor or the parent language. When you look at a lot of these scholars, Roger Blench admitted this in his paper in the UNESCO Symposium. He literally admitted it when he spoke about Nilo-Saharan, when he spoke about Niger-Congo, when he spoke about Afro-Asiatic. He used terms like controversial, unsettled. There's not a universal set of reconstructions and protoforms. There's not a universal set that has ever been proposed or agreed upon for Niger-Congo. The internal coherence of Afro-Asiatic is still in dispute. The time depth even needed for it is still in dispute. These so-called categories are not the degree of certainty of Indo-European. And the Americanist, they have the same approach as the Africanist because these are the same people. The aerial diffusion that they're using to define these African languages. Many indigenous American scholars have criticized the methodology of Greenberg for mass comparison and lumping all of these languages into different categories, right? Doing the colonial hodgepodge. Right? The same thing that they did where they literally went to Africa and freaking divided and conquered. The Hutu versus Tutsi model, this Hamiticist model. They use it to divide and conquer. When you look at the Hutus and the Tutsis, they're literally, the only difference is the pastoral economy and the ability to raise cattle. Otherwise, it might as well be the same people. We know these things. We know these things. Tribalization period is post-15th century period, the period of chattelization. That's where we got all these tribes because the economic conditions of the economic warfare that was being spurred on the African continent by these European slavers was having a negative impact. It was creating conflict between populations, and then there was excess labor from those conflicts. And from those excess labor and these ethnographers who are participating in this colonial project created the categorization system, which is Afrikanist linguistics. It is a colonial categorization system created by the instigators of the Ma'afa, the instigators of the annihilation of African people. Right? This is crystal clear. So when we look at this issue, when we examine the specific context and nuance on this issue, right, it's a much more complicated picture than what meets the eye. Shamarka Keita spoke about the EP2 marker, uniting the African continent. Right? Being an ancestor of, EM35 and EM2, right? These different paternal lineages. And you have various lineages of EV32 that are seen among Somalians and Cameroonians and Central Africans, linking Somalia and Central Africa, right? And we definitely know that Happy River Valley populations migrated into Central Africa. If you look at the Adulis inscription, it definitively states this. So again, we are much more united than we are led to accept, right? Especially if you look at the so-called Puntite baboons, Papio-Synicophallus, Papio-Anubis being an ancient Kemet, right? Detailing different lineages of Put that went into Central and Southern Africa. It's clear. So we got to stop following the propaganda from the Westerners, from these Africanists. We got to stay close to our African-centered scholars and methodology. This is really, really important. This is a lot of strife, right, that we don't necessarily need. And you definitively know, we're going to do a video about this. There were Somalis or Beriberi, Berbers as they were called in that time, who were enslaved. There's documentary evidence for that. We're going to get into that. But that's all I got for y'all on this. Shout out to y'all who've made it this far. I hope to catch y'all on the next one. Peace.
True. Let's go to Comma Green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kamji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Chimpy drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kamji verse.